who are interested in this issue of the forms of government read a copy of the Linz article. Linz's basic thesis was that the presidential system generally promoted authoritarianism and undermined liberal democratic values and institutions. And I'd like to quote from his article. He said, "A careful comparison of parliamentarism as such with presidentialism as such leads to the conclusion that on balance, the former, that is the parliamentary system, is more conducive to stable democracy than the latter. This conclusion applies especially to nations with deep political cleavages and numerous political parties." And Linz focused mainly on several countries in South America and in the Spanish-speaking world. He mentioned Sri Lanka in passing at the beginning of his article, and I'd like to suggest that the Linz thesis applies very much given the Sri Lankan experience with presidentialism from 1978 to the present. In the interest of time, I'm going to briefly outline the Sri Lankan experience and then comment on it using, where relevant, some of Juan Linz's arguments. Now, in Sri Lanka in 1978, the advocates of presidentialism basically put forward two arguments in favor of the presidential model. One, the need for stability and strong government. And two, the argument that a presidential system would actually empower the minorities because a president, the main political actor in a presidential system, would have to be elected by the whole country rather than be a person elected from a small constituency. Now, I do think one has to seriously critique these two justifications for the presidential system. What do we mean by stability? I think this is a very important question. Prior to 1978, we had in Sri Lanka nearly 50 years of franchise. Every 5 years, we used to change our governments. The elections were basically free and fair. And while some people may call this a sign of instability, I would argue that long term, it was actually a sign of stability. And I think it is very significant that post-1978, we have had much more instability in terms of respect for constitutionalism and the rule of law. But I think the main argument, though stability was used, the word stability was used, was the argument that a third world country like Sri Lanka needed a strong government, that the political and economic challenges of a developing country required that there should be a strong government for economic development, a strong government which could take tough, unpopular decisions that were in the long-term interests of the country. And indeed, the architect of the 1978 Constitution, President J.R. Jayawardena, famously once said, "We need an executive freed from the whims and fancies of the legislature." How that fits with one's notions of liberal democracy is, of course, an interesting point. With regard to the second argument, which I think is the more powerful one, that the presidential system empowers the minorities, I think the experience in Sri Lanka has been that the minorities are empowered at the time of a presidential election during the campaign. But the problem is that once the president is elected, he or she is so secure in power, is so powerful, becomes a virtual elected despot, that it is very difficult, not only for the minorities, but for anyone for that matter, to exert political influence or public opinion influence on the president. And this is a huge problem in Sri Lanka. And the fact that next week we have a choice between a very authoritarian incumbent president and a former military commander with no experience of democracy highlights, I think, the problems. And the voters of Sri Lanka are in a huge dilemma, because though the candidates are saying all the nice things during the election campaign and appearing to be very nice and committed to the rule of law, we all know that on the 27th of January, whoever is elected is going to be virtually uncontrollable and unaccountable because no one can exercise an effective check on the office of the president. Now, I'd like to say a word about the Sri Lankan system. It has been described actually as a mixed system, and Bob in his presentation talked about this sort of semi-presidential model. Our system has been described as a Gaullist model because it's supposed to have certain features of the French system. But it basically tries to combine some of the features of a pure presidential system with the British parliamentary executive model. So we have a president directly elected by the people for a fixed 6-year term. The president is the head of state, head of government, commander-in-chief of the armed forces, with special constitutional responsibility for defense. He or she is the head of the cabinet, chooses the prime minister, and chooses cabinet ministers who hold office at his or her pleasure. The one feature of the British parliamentary model that we have included in our constitution is that the president has to choose his or her cabinet members from the legislature. The president can also assign to himself any cabinet portfolio, and much to our concern, presidents of Sri Lanka have also retained the portfolios of finance, which in my view goes against all principles of parliamentary democracy. The president of Sri Lanka can dissolve the legislature virtually at any time. He has huge powers of appointment, judges, people to key institutions, commissions, election commissioners, public servants, governors of provinces. And in states of emergency, and in Sri Lanka, the state of emergency is the norm rather than the exception because of the ethnic conflict that we've had for many years, the president can even promulgate emergency regulations which trump or override the laws of parliament. Again, the president has blanket immunity, cannot be made a party to any legal proceedings for anything done in his official or private capacity. So if you're married to the president, you probably won't be able to divorce the president while the president is in office. And also the president can appeal to the people directly over the heads of the legislature at a referendum. So the only check that we have in the Sri Lankan constitution, and indeed Linz argues that this is one of the only checks in all presidential systems, is impeachment. And this is a very difficult task. In Sri Lanka, you need 2/3 majority votes on 3 separate occasions and a finding of guilt by the Supreme Court. So most people in Sri Lanka accept the fact that impeaching a president is politically impossible. So you have then what one political scientist in Sri Lanka has called an overmighty executive, and this is compounded by the fact that the rival centers of political power, the legislature and the judiciary, have very little control or very little power, and this is therefore a recipe for authoritarianism, which we have experienced increasingly in the last 3 to 4 years in Sri Lanka. So I'd like to also take this opportunity to warn against the dangers of hybridity or mixedness. And I was very happy that Bob Ray referred to this. Sometimes when you mix 2 systems, the danger is that you leave out the checks and balances of each system. If you had a pure presidential system where there was a strict separation of powers, as our colleague from Finland said, between the legislature and the executive, then perhaps the legislature would have functioned more effectively as a check on the executive. But since we don't have that, we have a system which really falls seriously short of checks and balances. Every system has its rationale, its logic, and its checks and balances. When you mix systems, the danger is that you leave some of these out. So in Sri Lanka, the presidential system has contributed significantly to the rise of authoritarianism, the rise of accountable, unresponsive governance in Sri Lanka, and it has also had a rather corrosive negative impact on liberal democratic institutions and values. And I'd like to expand on this a little bit in the time I have left, using some of the arguments that Juan Linz made in his article. One of his powerful points, in my view, is that a presidential system encourages a personalized style of politics and a kind of crude populism, which is the very antithesis of constitutionalism. You have a style of politics which focuses on the individual, on charismatic individuals, rather than on people with political experience, capacity, and commitment to liberal democratic values. Some scholars have even made the point that a presidential system is better for political outsiders to come in and take charge or take power, as opposed to people from the political elites. And they see this as something positive, but I think it could be argued that this is negative. Think of Chavez, Morales, Correa. Think of Estrada in the Philippines, Thaksin Shinawatra in Thailand, Wahid of Indonesia, and of course, Rajapaksa in Sri Lanka. Yeah? It would probably have been very difficult for a Gordon Brown or a Manmohan Singh or a Kevin Rudd to have become president under a presidential system. And in Sri Lanka, we have probably one of our most experienced politicians, the perennial leader of the opposition, Ranil Wickremesinghe, who's probably our most talented politician, who just can't win a presidential election because he lacks some of those charismatic populist attributes that has made Rajapaksa such a success as president. So I think we need to be conscious of this, and I'm sure you have your parallels in Nepal. The other danger is, of course, that a president who is elected by the whole people tends to think, well, I'm elected by the whole people, and therefore I have the legitimacy, the authority to basically do anything. It gives such a person an exaggerated sense of his own importance. And to use Linz's own words, the risk that he will tend to conflate his supporters with the people as a whole. And so, if you look at Sri Lanka, President Rajapaksa has deliberately and intentionally not implemented an entire